Mr. Bob Budnick is a friend to Lincoln Memorial University and the Carter and Moyer School of Education. He has been with us for at least 10 years. His company, he is the founder and the CEO of LiveText, and everyone here has had some part in LiveText, and our students have as well. As I mentioned yesterday, he spoke to the Institutional Effectiveness Committee of the university. I mentioned that we would not have been successful with NCATE or the State of Tennessee Department of Education had we not had the data and the analysis and the reports that LiveText offered us. We know that there are times that as we have had new faculty and new students come in, and learning the LiveText process has been something that they had to work on. At the same time, when we think of the fact that 10 years of data is available to the School of Education, and I didn't say much of this yesterday, but I guess I can say it here, it's an asset that it's not stored on our servers. It's an asset that it's stored off campus, that data from our School of Education. And because that's a great backup system, and when our systems go down, we're thankful that LiveText and the data that we have is still there. And so it's been a good relationship over these years, undergraduate, graduate programs. And Mr. Budnick has been speaking with accrediting organizations, with groups of universities and collaboratives across the nation, and has been working internationally, overseas, to assist with accreditation and assessment institutions, I think particularly we heard yesterday in the Middle East. So he comes with a wide-ranging experience to talk to us about accreditation, assessment that supports accreditation, and assessment that supports quality of our programs and what we are doing. And we have benefited greatly from the LiveText product and our relationship. Dr. Susan Gratz is, as you know, is our NCAPE CAPE coordinator, and also director of assessment for the School of Education. And Trent Clagg, who does a wonderful job with our technology, is coordinator of assessment resources. And the two folks work together to make sure that we have a good system and that it's working for us. And so I'm thankful for their support as well. But we're in for a treat today, because I think what we're going to hear is some good information about why we do what we do. That's always a good question. And let's give Bob Budnick, let's give him a royal welcome, can we?
Thank you.
Welcome.
Coming on after Mark Milheimer and supporting you for the last 10 years in terms of data security and everything else, that's now I'm a little nervous. Mark is an incredible speaker. I just thought it would be kind of interesting to share with all of you my 10 years worth of experience. Talk a little bit about accreditation and how that's evolved and how it's involved in higher education. Talk about best practices, and just kind of share some general stories in terms of, again, my 10 years experience helping institutions go through various different accreditation processes. You all go through CAPE or NCAPE, whatever we're going to call it nowadays, once every 7 years. We have 400 institutions that use LiveText. Unfortunately, we go through it every weekend. So every time you experience a reaffirmation or visit of some kind, we feel the same pressure, because everything has to work, everything needs to be in place, so you can kind of showcase really your student success. And that's what it's really all about. Sometimes we kind of forget about that, and we focus so much on doing what's important for accreditation that we kind of forget that at the end of the day, it's about making the student successful. It's about making the student employable. And which we know is very, very important, and that's what kind of drives everything that we do. So I know that sometimes when you're being asked to do certain things that you may not see the vision for, or it's just another thing that's added on to what you're trying to do with your students, sometimes just take a step back and say, think about this as from the student point of view. And that at the end of the day, if you can improve your program and you can understand the successes and the challenges that you have within your program and improve those, at the end of the day, it just benefits the students. And like I said before, we tend to forget that because, you know, accreditation is kind of on our mind all the time here. Let's see. I'm going to, like I said, kind of talk about the evolution of higher education and accountability. Talk about a little bit from a business point of view, what businesses look for in terms of employability, and then talk about how to keep this assessment process simplified. And then depending on time, I might go into a product demonstration, but most of you probably, how many of you have used live text? So you're pretty familiar with it, so I'll probably do something very brief in terms of that. If you've been reading anything in terms of higher education, and if you've been following Obama and Arnie Duncan and basically the world in terms of education, you know that what's the most important on everybody's mind right now is the cost of education. That when you look at what has happened over the years, the cost of education is just, it's grown over 200% in the last 30 years. So it's a lot more than what inflation has grown in. So everybody's concerned. And when I say everybody, it's not just your student coming out of Lincoln Memorial with $100,000 worth of debt and how they're going to pay that off. It's the federal government. The federal government's concerned that the secured loans that they have against the students, the student loans, is over $1 billion. And that is a very, well, I think it's $1 trillion now. It's a huge, huge responsibility to manage that debt process. So when you look at what drives all of this today is the cost of education. And because of that, institutions and businesses are finding very creative ways to accommodate that cost of education. The second component of that is employability, that the degree that they get is meaningful, so that it's not just understanding written communication skills, critical thinking skills, these higher order skills, but having employable knowledge and skills along with dispositions. So when I graduated back in 1979 with a business economics degree, because it was 1979, and if I look across the room, most of us probably graduated in the 60s and 70s, you know, if we had a degree, we had a job. It really didn't matter. It really didn't matter if I had a degree in psychology or if I had a degree in economics or business. Because I had a degree, I was guaranteed a job. We know those days don't exist anymore. So what the government's looking for, what businesses are looking for, what we are looking for, all of us, is we need students to have both. They need to have these higher order skills, and they also need to have these content-based knowledge skills. So the world demands both. No longer is it just good enough for you to be a communicator, but if you're an accountant, you need to understand accounting skills along with communication. So the world just requires both. It puts a lot more pressure on our students in terms of employability. And that's in terms of what everybody's looking for, is that do I get a meaningful degree as part of that? And then accreditation, which I'll go into in a couple of minutes, kind of supports that whole process. And then commerce, like I said before, you know, businesses like LiveText. I mean, we look for two skills. I mean, we look at their skill set, but most importantly, if they don't have the effective communication skills, and the employee doesn't have an effective critical thinking skills, they're not going to make it within our organization. We have about 80 employees. They work within teams. They work with our members on a daily basis. So having effective communication skills and having critical thinking skills, because we ask them to create new jobs. We ask them to create new positions. We don't have the resources to train them. We're making jobs up along the way. So it requires people to have critical thinking skills, and certainly if you're technical, like a programmer, you need to have programming skills. So we as a small business require that, and I bet if we go down the street, 99% of all the businesses out there require the same thing. And then there's global competition. You know, it's very, very interesting, and I'll tell some stories about the Middle East, but as I come a little further into this, but everything. I mean, you look at the number, I'm from Chicago, or Chicagoland area, and one of our premier public institutions is University of Illinois. Most of the enrollment from University of Illinois is now Chinese students. So, you know, in one way that's a good thing, in one way it's kind of sad because it doesn't allow our children from our state to go into a very prestigious program because they're taking a lot more people, foreign students, because they can make more money from it. But the world is becoming global. Competition it's global across the world. I mean, there are programs in India right now that are being set up to do third-party evaluation of students in colleges of business. So the days of just the professor doing the evaluation of the student against a certain skill set can now be outsourced to somebody in India that's going to do that evaluation because we decide we're not going to do it here. So everything is being competitive. The education system is being competitive. Businesses are being competitive. I'm going to talk about this accountability, and I'm not sure if any of you had an opportunity or cure to actually read about this, but accreditation really started after the GI Bill was formed. So it's been around for a long, long time. What happened back when the GI Bill was formed and all these soldiers were coming back from the war, the federal government wanted to offer these soldiers a free education system. They wanted to extend it, which I think was an incredible thing to do. It really jump-started our economy and took our economy to a different world. So all these soldiers coming back had a free education available to them. The feds had to make a decision that if they were going to become the accreditation agencies for all these institutions, or if they were going to offer that and outsource it out to these associations. The associations are SACS, HLC, WASC, all these regional associations. Well, so what the feds decided to do is they didn't want to get into the accreditation space, so they offered that to the accreditation agencies or the associations, and the associations built these accreditation components on top of their association. And the feds, through the Higher Ed Act, every 5 years, audit these 6 regional accreditation agencies. So I know sometimes we hear about academic freedom and that accreditation is somewhat restrictive to academic freedom. Well, sadly, I have to tell you that sort of slightly went out the door back in 1945 with the GI Bill. It's just taking us a long time to catch up and understand it. So those rules really changed back in the 40s. They didn't change 5 years ago or 10 years ago when SAC started putting more pressure on you or when NCATE started putting more pressure on you. It actually kind of changed back then. That if the feds are going to give money out and support higher education, they want a return on their investment and they want to be sure that institutions are properly accredited. So that's where the roots of this process came from. So over the years, U.S. education system has been ranked relatively high. It's always been number 1. And back in the early 2000s, we went from number 1 to number 7. And at the time, Margaret Spellings was the Secretary of Education, and Margaret Spellings said, well, we need to do an investigation, and we need to kind of figure out why, what's going on, and why did we go from number 1 to number 7. So she commissioned a program, and it was called eventually the Spellings Commission. And what she did is they did an investigation of why we went from number 1 to number 7. And it really kind of came back with several components. One was that the cost of education. The days of a student graduating from high school and going into higher education and it not being a cost burden, we're over. We know it's all been increased as part of it. The second component was that the students coming into higher education weren't properly prepared. So that we in the K-12 system haven't done what needs to be done in order for to prepare those students to be successful when they go into higher education. The third component was accountability. In the K-12 system, in the states, you have learning standards. In higher education, they don't exist. Now, that's a good thing, I think, because there are so many different other disciplines and so many different other paths you can take in higher education that I don't think it's a good idea that the feds get involved in that process or the states get involved in that process. So the feds think the same way, too, that let the institutions determine what their outcomes or standards are, and then let them build programs that are appropriate for those requirements. But the Fed said, that's a great idea, but we don't see it. We don't know. We don't see it. Nothing's published. Nothing says that these students graduating from this institution are meeting those goals or those outcomes. So back in 2005, what happened was they changed some laws in the Higher Ed Act. And in the Higher Ed Act, that's kind of like the Bible for all this process. So they've added more accountability in the Higher Ed Act. The regional accreditation bodies, and like I said, there's 6 of those 6 get audited every 5 years. So when they go up for audit, the feds can now introduce new standards and new requirements. So this all started in 2005. But when you think about it, every 5 years, one of the regionals are going through some type of audit. When that audit is completed, there's new standards added, and then there needs to be a vote from the board, from the committees, to actually execute that. The first one that went up for audit was actually SACS. So their audit went up in 2008. And I'll share with you how they adjusted their requirements for institutional effectiveness and student learning. The last one, which was last year, was WASC. So to give you some idea of how the feds are kind of turning up the heat on accountability, is in the SACS standards, basically their institutional effectiveness, I think it's 2.5, something like that, or 3.3, can't remember all of them. But it basically says, do you have a set of outcomes that you've defined, and are you measuring those sets of outcomes appropriately? Now, 2012, WASC standards doesn't say it. They now say, here are 5 outcomes you have to measure. So the days of you choosing your own, gone. So they came back and said, okay, most of our programs want to see critical thinking, oral communication, written communication, quantitative reasoning. So let's make that the standard. So every institution on the West Coast now has to measure those. So the next round that are coming to SACS and everybody else, that's going to be the beginning process. So the feds are just putting more and more pressure on having the regional accreditation agencies be more accountable to that process. HLC, which is the largest, the Higher Learning Commission, they're based in Chicago. They support about 1,200 institutions. They almost lost their license. What the feds wanted to do a couple of years ago is break it up and give it to SACS and middle states and break up HLC, because HLC wasn't holding institutions accountable. As a matter of fact, HLC was notorious for just kind of giving people credit and rubber stamping institutions. And guess what happened? All the for-profits moved to Chicago. You know, there was one of the for-profits was based down in Atlanta, and they had a real hard time with SACS. I know because they came to us and said, we're in trouble and we need your help. And they were on double secret probation. They basically had multiple chances with SACS to do what needs to be done to meet their standards, and they didn't. And they lawyered up, and they had a whole group of lawyers involved, and they were ready to go into litigation with SACS just to preserve their accreditation status. And they lawyered up, got, again, another year worth of probation, and they got off that probation. And one of the components was they weren't measuring student learning outcomes. And that was the number one citing. Now, we helped them. Sadly, what they did is they did it enough to get off accreditation, but when that was over, they stopped doing it. It was just, we're going to do it just because we're going to do it for accreditation, get it off with that. So they decided, wow, we're not going to go through that again. We're going to move our corporate headquarters to Chicago. And HLC just rubber stamped them. And when HLC rubber stamped them, when the feds came in the next year for the audit, they caught it. And all this activity that you have seen over the last 3 or 4 years on how the for-profits have been challenged, and all these new laws that want to be introduced in terms of the for-profits are because of that one incident. That when the feds caught it, and the feds started digging further and further into it, and they realized virtually every for-profit institution has a corporate headquarters in Chicago because HLC rubber stamped them. And that almost put HLC out of business because of that requirement. And it really kind of turned up the heat for everybody because of that process. You have to understand that the for-profits there's about 22 million students in higher education. The for-profits represent about 2 to 3 million of that population. Of that, they take over 20% of student loans, and their default rate is just astronomical. Their graduation rate is 18%. And their default rate on student loans is just insane. And then when the students default on those loans, because they're guaranteed by the federal government, we all pick that up. And so there's not a lot of nice things right now, in terms of the for-profits, but it's kind of caused this process. So in essence, what has happened is that's why this evolution of accountability in higher education took from 2006 basically up into 2013. And you're going to see more and more accountability aspects going out. Now, the nice thing is you've been doing it in teacher education and nursing and healthcare and social sciences for some time. Everything you've been doing in terms of doing competency-based assessment based on student performance is what the feds are asking the rest of the institution to do. So everything you're doing, you're not going to have to do more. The other programs are going to have to do more, and they're going to be more accountable to that process. So if you can continue doing what you're doing, you're fine. You're actually more than what they want. So what's nice is that you don't have to do something for SACS and then do something for CAPE. If you do the right things for CAPE, you'll meet those requirements. And this is just what I said earlier. 3.3 is the component in SACS, which is institutional effectiveness, and then 2.12, which is a component of the QEP. So this is just to give you a sense of what that statement looks like. I'm going to take a step back and kind of mention the Middle East. I talk about it and I say, wow, gee, we went from number 1 to number 7 and everybody's concerned and all the accreditation and the federal government's concerned. I've been fortunate enough to spend some time in the Middle East. And you have to understand that the Middle East, obviously they have lots of money. And they can buy anything and do anything. I mean, you look at the Burj and you look at their cities, it's just incredible. Every time they need something, they pump a few more barrels of oil out of the ground and they buy it. So they're in a very different situation. But what they can't buy is they can't buy education. And what they look for, as much as we think our education system is challenging, they see it as a pinnacle of success. So the U.S. is really, their higher education system is well recognized across the world as a good model to pursue. Enough so that these Middle East programs are all pursuing SACS, WASC, NCATE, AACSB. All these different programs are going into the Middle East because what the Middle East wants is they want a prestige. They want to build an economy that's not based on oil. They want to build an education system that's based on education. So when the oil is gone, they're self-sustainable because they have a very powerful education system. So they're not doing it for money, because one of the reasons why most institutions go through accreditation, it's a voluntary process, is because it allows you to kind of take student loan money. And so that's why most institutions do it. If you're, Dubai University or the higher college of technology, or you're Sultan Qaboos in Oman, you're not doing it because of taking student loan money. You're doing it because it's the right thing to do. It's to improve your overall program. So it's a very interesting culture over there, because it almost feels like it's here, but it's not. For an example, students don't know what homework's like. At 3 o'clock, when they finish their classes at some university, they're done. There is no understanding that there's homework. You either learn there at the institution or you don't. So trying to force a 4-year program into these programs is very, very challenging. The universities are very segregated. I was at the University of Emirates, and it's every university is segregated. You can walk onto a campus and you see this beautiful, the facilities are just gorgeous, because again, they have all the money in the world to build things they want to build and have whatever architects they want come in and build these things. But it's so funny, you walk down the campus and you don't know if you're on the men's side or the female side. They have these walls that you don't see them, but the university as a whole, but it's very segregated. When you walk down on the men's side, it's very sparse. You see very few Emiratis on campus. When you walk through the door, and you physically go through a security door with somebody to go into the female side, you see thousands of women. Because in that world, getting a degree, if you're a female and getting a degree, it's very, very prestigious. And it's very, very unique for them. And it's an opportunity for them to learn and grow and get away from the family, because their culture is so different. They're very repressed at their homes, but they explore and grow. And one of the concerns they have now is the graduation rate for the female students is so great compared to the male students that, and the female students are no longer just taking the teaching jobs. They're taking all the business jobs, all the accounting jobs. And so now they're very concerned about, what do we do with the males? Because the females are taking all the jobs. And people are hiring them. So the days of hiring a male or female, because all that world is becoming very international. So you're not being hired by an Emirati, you might be hired by Amoco or Standard Oil or some other international type company. So it's very, very interesting how that culture is changing rapidly, and they're very concerned. Interesting, plagiarism. The Emirati men think of getting a degree as getting a piece of paper, whereas the women think of getting a degree, having the knowledge and skills and dispositions across it. So the men will do anything to get the degree in the least amount of work. So, meaning that when you look at plagiarism over there, it's rampant. So the female, they're afraid to actually cheat because they're afraid something can happen to them. The men, they don't care. And the funny thing about it is, in their culture, that if the female students get caught cheating, they get disciplined. If the men get caught cheating, nothing happens. So, like I said, this culture is kind of way out there. So they have these different culture components kind of bringing it all together. I did a session out there last November, and it was for an international conference they did for the country, and I was a guest speaker. And it was so funny because the sheikhs, there are 7 sheikhs that basically run the UAE. And one of the sheikhs has been the administrator of education for years and years, who, by the way, is also the chancellor of the universities. So, I mean, again, kind of crazy. It's all kind of tied together. And so I'm supposed to present at 10 o'clock, I think, that morning. And I was coming on after the sheikh did the opening session. Well, the sheikh was running late. And so they said, well, you got to get up there and you got to start. And I go, well, what happens when the sheikh comes in? They go, well, you just stop wherever you are, and then you have to leave the room because the sheikh has to be the first one coming in. Oh, all right. So I get up there, and I kind of start for the first 2 or 3 minutes, and someone says, hey, the sheikh's helicopter landed. And Bob, you have to get off the stage. And then so I get off the stage, I go down, they take me down where the sheikh's coming out of his car with his entourage. And they start pushing me. And they go, well, you got to get close to the sheikh. The closer you are to the sheikh, the more important you are. I go, oh, all right. So, the sheikh does his thing and a great little presentation. And then I'm waiting now to go on. And, I got an audience of a couple thousand people. And the president of that university decides, because now the sheikh's on campus, and it was done at one of their universities. Well, the sheikh's on campus. He decides he's going to take the sheikh for a tour right in the middle of this conference and have him plant the ceremonial tree in their garden. Well, you got 2,000 people waiting. And I'm thinking, well, it's getting closer to lunch. These people are just sitting in their room. I go, what do? Do I go up on stage? They go, no, you have to follow the sheikh and go on the tour. Well, these 2,000 people are waiting in this room for a conference that's been scheduled. It's a national conference on education, for higher education. So the only non-Emirati in this group of people, other than me, who stood out, I'm 6'5", and everybody else is about 5'8", 5'10", was the pilot for the sheikh, who was an American Marine, wearing American Marine fatigues. So we're going through this, little tour, and everything was staged. I didn't know that, but the sheikh was supposed to show up in this room where the student was doing a presentation and just sit down and listen to the student. I didn't know that was staged. I just thought the sheikh actually just jumped into this room. And the student was doing was an Emirati man, and he was doing a PowerPoint presentation on the dangers of smoking. And I'm sort of listening to this, and I'm thinking, is this a joke? This is something my 5th grade student, my sons in 5th grade would be doing, not somebody that's 23 years old on the dangers of smoking. But it was, scheduled. Then the sheikh would ask some questions about the smoking, and the student didn't have any answers. It was just all practiced. So as I'm walking further with this Marine, and I said, well, can I ask a question? I go, why are you flying the sheikh around the country as opposed to another Emirati? He goes, well, we had an incident here a few years ago. If you don't understand where the UAE is, it's right across the water from Iran. And so what happened was, about 5 years prior, there was an incident where the Emiratis were up with the American F-16s flying over the Persian Gulf and just kind of doing their thing. And the Iranians locked on to the planes. And all 5 of the Emiratis in 5 F-16s evacuated, just tossed their planes into the ocean. And so he was telling me that story. He said, from that day on, all the sheikhs got American Marines to fly them everywhere because they didn't trust their own people, that when they're just dumping planes into the Persian Gulf, how much are they going to protect them? So I just thought that was kind of an interesting story as I was kind of walking through this. But then, I get up, it's now 11:30, and I say, well, I have an hour planned, what do we do? Well, you just go for an hour and we'll just delay lunch. And so that's that culture there. The culture is just constantly moving things, all these moving parts. And then while I'm there, I find out that that sheikh for 25 years gets demoted and his brother gets promoted, all in a matter of 4 hours. He did that presentation, and 4 hours later, he's been demoted, and now there's a new sheikh. And he's got all these other ideas. But it's a crazy, crazy world out there. The point is that we sometimes criticize our education system. They all want to be like the U.S. They see value in it. So as much as we don't think sometimes that we have value in our process, they have value in the process. This is something I want to mention to you, is this cost of education. If you've been kind of following Obama, this is something that he's been talking about for some time. And he's really called out to businesses and higher education to come up with creative ways to bring the cost of education down. The point is that the world of education, in terms of classes, courses, and credit hours, has been around since 1893. Harvard actually started that process. And the days of traditional education and students getting a traditional degree is changing. And one of the reasons why that changed is the cost of education. You're going to see in the next 10 years a wealth of different learning modalities and delivery systems being introduced into higher education because of the cost of education. That all points to what you've been doing. If a student is going to take a MOOC, how many of you followed MOOCs or know what MOOCs are? MOOCs are massive online courses where Stanford, Harvard, MIT, all these different programs now offer them. They actually offer them in education too. If you go to Coursera, you can actually take a MOOC. And a MOOC starts with about 100,000 students. It's massive online, see, where is it? I have it up there. Open online courses. So that's a very interesting challenge that we all have, right? Because we don't want to deny a student, if there is a thought leader out there on a subject area, you don't want to deny a student from listening to that thought leader. If you can get the best person to present to that student, why not take advantage of that? So these people that are doing, the professors or the instructors that are doing these MOOCs are very well-known academics. And so these programs are wrapped around them. MOOCs don't even start with no less than 100,000 students. So they don't even start one unless there's 100,000 students. And then the assessment process is all done by their peers. So the groups are, the 100,000 students are broken down into groups, and then those groups are all, they do projects and they do self-assessment, and then based upon how, statistically, how everything starts to score out, it starts to look towards if that student actually met those requirements. And if the student wants, remember they're open and they're typically free or close to being free. However, if you want a badge or certificate, you have to pay for it. So it's somewhere between $50 and $75, and now you have a certificate that you took this MOOC, and it's some type of degree. Well, at the end of the day, that might meet the Stanford's requirements or Coursera's requirements, but it may not meet what Lincoln Memorial wants as part of the process. So you need to kind of start to think about, how are we going to give student credit for work that's done outside of the classroom? It's all changing. So 10 years from now, the students actually getting 120 credit hours and having 15 contact hours for every credit hour, that world is all changing. And all these different delivery methods are going to need to be incorporated, and you're going to have to start to think about, how do we measure that? So how are we going to give credit for that process? And you probably see it now with your students. I mean, how many of your students here got all 120 hours from the institution compared to taking a couple classes from a community college? I bet you virtually every student here has taken some coursework outside of your traditional curriculum that you have here as part of that. Employee certification and training That's a big thing too. I mean, if someone's working for a business and they get a certificate for project management, you need to understand how you're going to be able to provide credit to that. So this idea that the learning only occurs within the classroom and we're going to only offer credit for that process is all evolving. And that you need to kind of develop that. But the nice thing of what you've done here is because you have those conceptual frameworks that you've developed, you set a set of outcomes or standards that you can measure across. So it doesn't matter if they take a MOOC or they're coming in from some community college that they took a couple classes for, or they worked and had some real world experiences. You have something to measure it by. And it can be measured outside of the classroom because you have a set of outcomes and standards. And that's what this is all going to be. I mean, can you imagine on the social media, if a student's doing a really good job in terms of a blogging or their Twitter account or even their Facebook account, and that can demonstrate communication skills to parents or to learners or to other people out there, why not give credit for that? It shows that they have effective communication skills. So all this is evolving higher education. And it's driven primarily because of cost and bringing that cost of that education down. This is kind of what I talked about before, that how institutions are moving towards providing some type of competency-based education. You may, as an institution, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you may offer a completely different type of program. This is an example of Western Governors. Western Governors, they have cohorts going through, and they do kind of what they call a flipped classroom. So the whole idea is that you don't really have courses, you have a competency. So they pick a competency, you work towards that competency in these cohorts, and then whenever you feel you're ready, you get evaluated against that competency. And so they have a lecture series, and then they actually have a group of evaluators that when a piece of work, a presentation or a paper or something that you did represents that skill set for that competency, when that's submitted, they have a group of evaluators, and they have 3 evaluators for every piece of work being submitted by these students. So, and if 2 of the 3 agree in terms of the assessment process, the student is awarded that requirement. If the 2 don't agree, then there's a third-party evaluator that steps in, and if they get a match on those 2, the student is awarded their competency. Very, very different process. Argosy, a non-for-profit institution, same thing. They're developing a whole MBA program that's based on competencies. So, and the federal government's now changing those requirements, where it used to be contact hours and courses and classes and credit hours. They're changing that. So it's opening up the door for programs to be more creative as part of that process. So, which means that you're going to have to compete with this. So that means you're going to have to adopt some of these models. I kind of talked about the MOOC and the flipped classroom. That's where you have a series of lectures by certain people, and then the faculty really become the instructors really help and guide the students as part of that process. And you probably hear more of that within the K-12. And then we talked about this dual enrollment process, that people are getting credit for work that's done outside the institution. I'm going to talk a little bit about, we talked about accountability, we talked about the cost of education. I just want to share with you some surveys that an organization called AAC&U, it's the American Association for Colleges and Universities. If you haven't followed their work, it's a great piece of work. You can go to their website. They do a lot of surveys back to various different employers. And they're a liberal arts association that has about 1,500 members, primarily 4-year institutions like Lincoln Memorial. So they kind of support the mission of a liberal arts program. So they've contracted and have done quite a number of surveys over the years asking employers, and all types of employers, employers in education, employers in businesses, employers in healthcare. They've done several different surveys in terms of what businesses are looking for. And this is just some of the results of the last one they did in 2010. And I said this earlier, that what employers are looking for. So if you have a chance to kind of read this, I'm not going to read this, all these as part of it, but it's basically saying that companies are looking for more. They're not only looking for those higher order skills, but they're looking for those technical skills as well. So in order for you to kind of fulfill those requirements. And then, and I'll share back this PowerPoint so you can use it, repurpose it back. I'll send it to Michael. Michael can pass it on to everybody. These are the areas that businesses have been looking for in terms of what they want to see improvement in. So the idea, the first one is really critical thinking. How do I take lots of information, evaluate it, and understand it? Because what's happening in the world is information doubles every 2 years. The days of us memorizing something are gone. It's too much information. So we need a new way of learning and retaining information. And how do we do effective research? And how do we go through all the information on the internet, for an example, and pick what's fact versus fiction and come to some process? So that becomes really, really important. 67% want potential new employees to understand global position and global impact, because we are in a competitive world. And then, when you start to look down here, civic knowledge, community engagement's down at 52%. But these are the needs, that what they're looking for in terms of what's important to this group of businesses, all types of businesses they want. And then what do they want when they're looking for a new potential employee? Well, as you can see down here, the results of a multiple choice test has very little value. I have to tell you, I can't tell you of our employees, I don't think I've ever asked what their GPA was or how long it took them to get through the four-year institution that they went to get their degree. One of our best employees we had, and unfortunately he moved on because he was so good. He actually became a president of a small company. But Phil came, and his degree was in, he got it from a for-profit as a chef. So he got a degree as a chef. But that guy had incredible communication skills and critical thinking skills. He picked up live text faster than anybody else I knew. And anything we put in front of him, he would pick it apart, put it back together again, and reinstitute it with his methods. He was just incredible. So it really doesn't matter. I mean, if you have really good critical thinking and communication skills, you can accommodate that process. So, when they're out there looking at, employers want to see sample pieces of work. What we do when we hire or we're going through a candidate for potential employment is, the first thing is, like I said before, we look for communication skills. So when we narrow down that candidate, we ask them to come back and do a PowerPoint presentation to a group of people within the office. And we'll pick anybody from the office, so we have a group of people, and see how this person communicates with this group. We ask them to do a PowerPoint on whatever they want. So whatever they have a passion for. We have had people come in with kayaks and talking about kayaking. We have people with tarot cards. We've had some guy came in he was into the Civil War with these mini cannons. And he talked about these mini cannons and all the components of these mini cannons. So it's been pretty interesting. It's been kind of educational for me to kind of listen to some of these presentations. But that's how we look at their communication skills. And then what we do is, if we like them, what we start to do is we go through the process of emailing them. We're asking them bits and questions. Hey, can you send us this? What about this? Can you come in? And we start to look at how they communicate via email. We're looking at their grammar. We're looking how they form their sentence structure. So we saw their oral communication skills when they did their PowerPoint. Now we're looking at their written communication skills, because we don't believe anything that we see on our resume. So we actually want to see real time how this person's effectively communicating. So employers are looking for those skills, and it becomes really, really important. And then we look for projects they have done in the past. So we want to see real projects they have done. So students doing internships, students working on real world projects become really important. Now, the funny thing is, when you step outside of higher education and you're in the business world, I don't think any business gives an employee a grade. This idea of having A, B, C, or D, or F doesn't exist outside of higher education. How is most employees evaluated? They're evaluated against a rubric based on a set of goals for the year. I mean, here's a perfect example of Federal Express. Federal Express, this is their annual evaluation form. It's a rubric. So the employee is given a set of requirements for the year, and then they're evaluated twice a year. If they're a new employee, they're evaluated twice a year. If they're an older employee, they're evaluated once a year. And not only do you see, when you read this, some of the technical requirements, but they're also looking at what? Teamwork, communication, working with the customers. So the whole process is those skills are all embedded. You need to have those technical skills along with those higher order skills. That's what they're all looking for. So why is it that we're so hung up on focusing on giving students an A, B, C, or D, as opposed to doing what you've been doing really, is using a rubric to evaluate a certain set of standards or competencies? Because that's what the world is doing when they step outside of education. You're just simulating a process of that. This is a very interesting statement. The State Farm has an evaluation for potentially new employees, and their evaluation is really based on higher order skills. Just like us, we're looking at communication, critical thinking skills. 50% of the new potential employees that do that evaluation fail the test. 50%. If you can't communicate, the idea, the days of you being an effective accountant and doing all, let's say, doing all your accounting processes and developing balance sheets and cash flow analysis, but not effectively having the ability to communicate that to somebody, those days are gone. You know, there are people out there that can do both. So businesses are requiring and looking at both. I'm going to kind of just talk a little bit about this process of keeping things simple. So often, we take a very simple process and we make it very complex. I don't know why we do. Of all the disciplines that I've been involved in, from businesses to education, education seems to be most interesting in terms of taking something simple and making it very complex. Don't know why, but it happens. I can't tell you how many conferences I've attended where I've listened to institutions, members from institutions do sessions on assessments. And I'd be going to SACS or HLC or AACSB or CAPE or whatever it might be, and I would hear some person talk about their effective assessment process at the institution. How they're going to get how all these faculty are building their own rubrics, and you know, how they're doing all this alignment to standards and outcomes and everything like that. And I'm listening to this process, I'm going, there's no way anybody can do this other than if you're, you know, if you're dictated to that process. So very few institutions can kind of accomplish that goal. But I'm in this room, and there's maybe 50 or 100 people, and everybody's taking notes down on bad processes. Because that speaker is up there talking about the process, people think, wow, that speaker really knows what they're doing. So I'm going to take this process that they're describing, and I'm going to bring it back to my institution. And then they're going to go to 3 or 4 other sessions and hear even more complex processes. And then they come back to the institution and they start to try to implement these crazy ideas that a one-up institution had. And they take a very simple process and they make it very, very difficult. And sometimes that's what we do. We take a process that really is quite simple and we make it more challenging than it needs to be. And I want to talk about that. And you've been kind of doing this you have been doing this in the College of Education. But I'm going to kind of talk about it from a bigger point of view. How you want to keep this process simple. It starts with the mission of the institution. If you look at SACS, the first standard they want is, does the institution have an effective mission? So a mission is something that you believe in that's probably founded by the forefathers of the institution. It's something that has its roots, and really the root of it shouldn't change. What should change is as the business, as the community, as the alumni, as the faculty, as the world changes, the mission should evolve. So it has its core. If I'm a faith-based institution, I want my mission to be about the faith of the institution. But I want it to evolve over time. And it evolves over time when you survey out to the community, to the alumni. So asking them what they want, what's important, what should we do as an institution? Because we're all about learning, right? So we have to learn as an institution as part of that process. So surveying out on a regular basis to your stakeholders, understanding what's important, what they see. So often when we send surveys out, we sometimes forget to send surveys out about certain goals or outcomes. Hey, did you have a great time at Lincoln Memorial? Did you graduate in time? Did you get the job that you wanted? We're not asking them. We should ask them about the outcomes or the goals that we developed as an institution. Did you feel that Lincoln Memorial offered you the ability to improve your communication skills for your current employment? Asking specifically around that conceptual framework or that outcome or that standard, whatever you call that statement, asking those questions. You should look at the regional accreditation requirements because you don't want to be way off in left field as you start to develop your outcomes if the regional accreditation requirements are evolving. Like I mentioned, WASC on the West Coast, they have 5 outcomes you have to measure. So you need to incorporate those 5 into your process. You can't no longer just pick anything that you want. You need to look at where trends globally are going. Has anybody ever heard about the Bologna Project? Think of it in the European marketplace. They're trying to basically develop a set of outcomes that everybody articulates against. And that project's been around for about 20 years, and so it allows students to transfer from country to country because of that process. And it's been a long, painful process over there, but it's finally kind of coming to a conclusion. Well, now there's something new called the DQP, Degree Qualification Profile, and you should take a look at that. It's a way for globally to start to standardize on processes and outcomes in some way. So you want to look at these global factors when you develop out your institutional learning outcomes. And then eventually, all of this feeds into developing a set of learning outcomes. Now, I know that in teacher education, you have state mandates and you have other requirements that put more pressure on you. But as an institution, most institutions try to strive for somewhere between 6 and 8 outcomes that they would really want to measure every student when they cross that stage at the end of their career at that institution, that they met those requirements. And I've been at places where institutions have 18, 20, 30, just a ridiculous amount of standards. And some of them are wonderful goals, but you can't measure them. You know, lifelong learning is a wonderful goal, but how are you going to measure it? You know, follow somebody to their death? I mean, it's pretty hard. So sometimes you have to kind of separate a goal from an outcome or standard that you're trying to measure and look at those most effectively. So I was doing some work with an institution a couple years back, and they were adopting LiveText university-wide, and they asked me to come in and meet with their assessment committee. And so I was there with the provost. I met with the assessment committee, about a dozen people, and they had, I think, 18 or 19 outcomes. And when I started asking where the history of some of these outcomes came from, most people didn't even know. They were just kind of blindly following these outcomes because they don't know the history of where they came from. There was one outcome that was based on a specific course. And when I asked the question about, well, why is this an institutional outcome for a specific course, they said, well, that professor had tenure. And he was afraid that if we didn't have that in it, his course would go away. And we just accommodated him. So I said, okay, well, and some of them were competencies. They weren't really outcomes or standards that we're trying to measure. So I asked them, I said, listen, we're not implementing live text. What we're going to do is we're going to do an academic workshop. I want you to have 3 sessions set up in the fall semester where you're all going to get together and you're going to get those 18 down to 6. So I want you to get down to 6 outcomes. And then let's see what the spring looks like. So they worked really, really hard, and they actually got it down to, I think it was 7. It might have been 8. I can't remember. They got them all the way down, and then next semester, I said, okay, let's think about where you want to measure them. So there's this belief in higher education that just because I have a program outcome, I have to measure it in every course. A good process for assessment is you want to measure an outcome 3 times. Somewhere at the beginning of a student's experience, somewhere in the middle of a student's experience, and some type of capstone at the end. So in general, that's what most institutions attempt to do. Now again, if you're a healthcare program or teacher education, you might have to do a little bit more than that, but even that kind of follows those rules. I see institutions trying to measure every outcome in every course. Sometimes you can align an outcome to a course because you're introducing an outcome. Sometimes you're reinforcing an outcome, but you don't have to assess every outcome in every course. You make the process very challenging, very difficult, and it's unmanageable. So you're only going to get pieces of data because it's an unmanageable process. So working and doing this has nothing to do with technology. This has to do with academics working together to come up with a set of outcomes that you truly believe in, that you want to measure. From there, hopefully, at the college or program level, you start with the institutional mission, you start with the institutional outcomes, and what you develop should be a derivative of what was developed at the institution level. I mean, if the institution has something for communication, then one of your conceptual frameworks should support communication. So it should be an extension of what the institution does. So often what happens in higher education is we all work in silos and we don't connect these things together. So then at the end of the day, what happens, now you're managing 2 different unique processes because the institution wants you to do this, but College of Education wants you to do this because no one thought about looking at how do we bring both processes together. So when we measure written communication skills in teacher education, it also meets the requirement for the institution. So you start from the top and you work down versus from the bottom and you work up. And it should all be about academics. It should be about the faculty working together in that department and program to develop that. It shouldn't be a top-down process. So the process should look like this. Again, you've been living it for some time. But you define those set of outcomes. You then develop a measurement criteria. So those are the competencies that you typically wrap around an outcome. So if you want students to be effective written communicators, then what is it about communication? We're looking at grammar, style, their voice, whatever it might be. So you break down the competencies. You identify assessment events. This is very interesting. I say events because we think today in our world, we think courses, right? We think about where in a course can we evaluate that effective outcome or standard. You have to start thinking out of the box for the future. It may not be in a course. It may be that MOOC that student took. It may be some work that the student did at some school district that we're going to measure that process against. So it may be outside of a course. So start to think outside of a course where I'm going to evaluate some of these skills. And then you build an assessment product, which is typically some type of rubric that is built off that process. And you assess and report data. So that's where all this data kind of comes out of the system and provides you that information. So you went through this already, so I'm going to kind of go through it very quickly. You have a set of standards or outcomes. Hopefully what you're doing is you're pulling in the course rosters from the data tile system. You're identifying the courses, where you're going to do assessment in the courses, where you're going to do it. You have, I hope you have, some common rubrics that you're all using as opposed to everybody developing their own. One of the challenges I always find is that when I attend these conferences, teacher education does a pretty good job because you've been doing it for years. But the newbies to it, general education, when I hear some of these sessions, they say, well, we have a set of outcomes for written communication, so we asked each English professor to build a rubric based on those outcomes. And then they can't quite understand when they try to pull data out of the systems that they have, why it doesn't make sense. Because I built a rubric for written communication, and you built one, and you built one, and now we're going to try to bring it all together and normalize it in some way. And maybe you're an expert at building a rubric and I'm not. And so your rubric might be a 5-point rubric, and mine might be a 3-point rubric, and yours might be a pass-fail. How am I going to normalize that? So hopefully what you're doing is, if you have some set of standards that you have, you're building some common rubrics that everybody's going to use. And some of those rubrics hopefully are not specific to a course assignment. The rubric should be more based on the action of the rubric and the competency of the rubric, not to a specific assignment, unless it's a very specific to a skill set you're trying to measure within that assignment. So kind of keeping that as part of it. So you develop these rubrics, you then have common key, you distribute out these rubrics to the appropriate courses, then faculty or third-party evaluators are now going in and scoring up those students. And you're all kind of familiar with that process. Once that happens, data comes out of the system. And we're really excited. I know that some of you who attended the conference over the summertime, is we introduced a new product that's available to you. It's called LiveText Analytics, and it really allows you now not only to look at like rubric-based data, but all types of testing data. So you can bring in the student's GPA, bring in the ACT scores. Are you a Praxis state? Yes, okay, so you can bring the Praxis scores in. We were talking a little bit earlier yesterday we were talking about maybe bringing in the value-added data. I think I did some research on it last night. It's called the value-added data, which is the cut scores that the state are developing for showing teacher performance. So you can bring that in. So part of the analysis is not only are you looking at how the students were here, when they were here on campus, but you're also now required from a CAPE point of view to track their success once they leave the institution, which is good for you, because if you can bring that information back in, you can now look at your curriculum and your program and make changes based upon those student successes. Or look for patterns. You might find a certain type of student does really well here at LMU, not only through the program, but with the learners when they leave the program. So you can start to recruit those types of students and focus more on what you're really good at doing and bringing in the appropriate students. So data analysis has lots of benefits that you can use as part of that process. And then you can kind of cut data multiple different ways. That's what I have. I can go into the LiveText demonstration if you want me to, or maybe I can show analytics if you want. Would that be helpful? While I'm logging in, is there any questions just in general I can answer for you? Was there anything about education that I probably don't have answers for, but I can take an attempt at responding to if you have a question? But it's pretty exciting, I guess, when I think about where education's going. I guess maybe because I'm a person who likes change, and I like to be in a world of constant change. That's why I like technology, because it does change. I know sometimes people feel that as a challenge, but I think if you can embrace it as an opportunity of learning and trying all these different new learning modalities and these different processes and how your students are evolving, I think you can have a lot of fun if you kind of embrace where it's all going, as opposed to trying to stop it from growth, because we can't stop anything. You know, the only constant is change. I'm going to kind of just show you some examples. of what you can actually do with data. Okay. Live text analytics, like I said before, allows the institution, so whoever your coordinator is, to really kind of pull lots of data. And when they pull this data, they can also share it back with you. So if you're doing research or you're working on some type of project, you have lots of access to this data. So you can start to look at certain patterns of challenges or success. What you're seeing is a dashboard. Dashboards are multiple different reports that can be constructed. And then once these reports are constructed, they can be nested in a dashboard, and then these dashboards can be shared with various different email addresses. So maybe someone would create these reports and share them. So faculty would have standard reports that they can get and see, and these reports change on a real-time basis. So there's a lot of data behind this. So I'm going to kind of go in very briefly and show you an example of the type of data that's available to you. Didn't load all the way up here. There's 74 points of data, and I apologize, this isn't bringing up all the information that we need. So let me see if I can bring up a report. So the way this process works, there's actually, for some odd reason, the screen's cutting off here. Like I said, there's 74 data points. But the way this process works is if I wanted to just kind of say, well, here's my assessment counts, what courses did they come from? I can just drag over into this canvas. And what I'm doing is I'm pulling data from here into here. So this, like I said, I'm missing all the measurement points. And I'm also missing some of the gender, race, and all these other profile pieces. If I drag and drop this information in, and then when I drag and drop this information in, I can come over here and I can graph it different ways. And then I can either PDF these, I can export this out, I can share this via email to whoever I want as part of that process. So this allows me to start to really pull apart data. And the data doesn't have to be just rubric-based data. The data could be, I want to look at a student's praxis results versus their GPA versus the average GPA for that department. And I want to see if that student started out and had a certain cut ACT score or SAT score. So I can start to look at other points of data beyond just the rubric-based data. So analytics allows you to import all this different data. And this is what I was talking about before, is importing in some of that state data on the learners and having that associate with a certain student that graduated from the institution. So not only can you track them while they're at the institution, but now through analytics you can track them outside of the institution. But it does require you to pull that state scorecard and load it into the system itself. Now what's nice about Tennessee, just like Florida, you actually have the technology and you have the data that was developed by the state and made available to you. There's a lot of states out there where they don't have access to a scorecard or any type of value-added score. So, and if you look at some of the new CAPE requirements, that's what they want to see. They want to see learner performance on your college graduates. And I don't know how some people are going to actually do it because, like I said, certain states are much further along than others. But there's probably only a handful of states that actually have enough data to allow you as a teacher prep program to go get that data to help fulfill the CAPE requirements, the new CAPE requirements. So that's it. I want to thank everybody for allowing me to share my experiences with you. I want to thank you all for helping us grow LiveText over the years. I want to thank you all for, if you've ever called our customer service or talked to our implementation, your voices are always heard. I mean, we have the way we do things at LiveTex is when we hear from you, from support, from implementation, from me being out in the field, or from one of our field consultants being out in the field, all that information goes back to development. So we have a group internally that meets once a week that is representative by implementation, by customer support, and by development. And what their responsibility to do is listen to what our members want and how we can improve things, and then schedule out the development of those products. And sometimes you may not see us do things right away, because sometimes what we're trying to do is really understand what the business problem is. You know, so often what we all want to do is we want to jump to putting a Band-Aid on the problem, as opposed to really understanding what the root of what's driving that problem. So we work really, really hard to really understand what the root is, that's what someone wants to get accomplished, and then we build technology around what you want to accomplish. You're going to see a lot of changes in LiveTex in the fall of next year. We're re-engineering a brand new platform that is state-of-the-art. It's very, very cool. It's taken us a long time to construct it. Before we wrote one stitch of code, it took us almost 10 months to understand every, we call them use case requirement, that you as members wanted and had challenges with over the years. So we came up with about 500 use cases that we wanted the new platform to support. And what we did differently in terms of technology development this time is, as opposed to saying we're going to build a solution for each one of these 500 problems, what we're going to do is we're going to understand how we can take these 500 problems, group them in some way, and then we're going to build a platform for each one of these groups. So very different. It's a new way of programming. It's a new way of developing. And so we're really excited. It came down to 5 categories. Those 500 requirements actually nested down into 5 categories. So what we're doing is we're building an engine to address those 5 requirements. And based on that, then it meets those 500 requirements as part of the process. But more than anything else, when a new business requirement comes up, because we built the engine based on those categories, it should accommodate that based on the platform that we're building. So you're going to see a lot of changes in the fall of 2014. We'll start to preview it sometime around March or April, so you won't be shell-shocked when you come back from a summer break, and your LiveTex is going to look different, because it's going to look very different. It's developed. Not only is it going to be, from a workflow point of view, very, very flexible, very, very powerful, and hopefully, we hope that we're building something much more intuitive than what we have today. That it's also platform independent. So it doesn't matter if I pick up my iPhone and want to use LiveTex on my iPhone, if I want to use LiveTex on a PC, if I want to use LiveTex on an iPad or an Android. The platform is completely independent. So the days of having the screen, try to make it all work on one screen, are gone. The new platform supports multiple different platforms. So if you're on a small device, the system will automatically reformat to that device. If you're on a larger device, it's going to reformat to that device. Nothing you have to do. You don't have to choose this view or that view. It just automatically happens. So we're very excited. It's long overdue. The product that we've had out, that you've been playing with, has been out since 2008. And so a lot of technology has changed over the years. So we're going to take advantage of all this new technology. And so we're really excited in terms of the direction that we're taking, and hopefully you'll feel the same. With that, thank you. Thanks for taking time out of a busy schedule and joining me.